I'll charge if I want to. What can you do about it? Marjorie Hale's voice hissed as her hand gripped the Tesla cable. A few heartbeats later, a deafening blast. Millions worth of cars turned to ash. I watched her collapse. Power thieves always get swallowed by the current. Justice doesn't always need a courtroom. Sometimes it only takes one well-timed act of resistance. What state are you in? Have you ever seen justice erupt right before your eyes? On the first day we moved to Lakeshore Heights, I naively believed we had found a refuge from the city's noise. My daughter, Amira, squealed when she saw the lake shimmering in the afternoon light and said, "Daddy, it's so beautiful here." I smiled, convinced we had finally begun a new chapter. But no one warned me that beneath that polished surface was a swamp of power and prejudice, where a few self-appointed royals acted like rulers over land that wasn't even theirs. The electric bill was the first sign. The numbers spiked abnormally, inconsistent with the habits of just a father and daughter. I didn't rush to blame a malfunction. Experience told me there were human hands behind this. So I installed a camera in the garage, not out of curiosity, but because I had started to smell something off, and I was not wrong. That night, when my phone screen blinked with an alert, I opened it with mild curiosity, but what I saw froze me. That woman, Marjorie Hale, president of the HOA, the one who walked like the ground should make way for her heel, was calmly plugging a Tesla charger into my outlet. Not a hint of stealth, not a trace of shame. She did it with the confidence of someone convinced she was entitled. Her light-colored suit hugged her frame, and the lighting made her look more like a power broker in a real estate ad than a regular resident. I watched her every move, cold to the point of spine-chilling. She smoothed her hair, admired the Tesla like it were proof status. Her face expressionless, hand steady, she simply plugged in and walked away. In that moment, I understood I wasn't the victim of petty theft. I was the subject of it. She wanted to see if I would push back, or, like most residents here, stay silent, pay up, and keep living under the shadow of retribution. The next morning, I walked out with the mindset of a man ready. When I saw Marjorie, I didn't look away. I met her gaze, my voice calm but cold. "I have footage of you charging your Tesla in my garage. Care to explain?" She paused for a second, then smiled. There was something embarrassing about that smile. It was cold and cheap, like metal scraping metal. Tilting her head, she said each word like a gift. "We live in a community. Electricity is something we share. If you don't like it, maybe Lakeshore isn't for you." Every word slapped me in the face. I gave a dry laugh. "Share? Huh? That's funny. Sharing usually starts with consent, not sneaking around." She shrugged, her eyes sweeping over me like I was an obstacle. "You're new. You don't understand yet. Lakeshore has standards. Those who fit stay. The rest soon realize they're in the wrong." That sentence cut deeper than the act of stealing electricity. It exposed a blatant mindset of discrimination. She assumed I didn't belong here, that my skin, my background, or the way I lived didn't fit the elite mold she had constructed. I saw Amira running toward me, still wearing that innocent smile. I swallowed every bitter word, not wanting to ruin her morning. But inside me, fire had ignited, red hot and merciless. In the days that followed, Marjorie's eyes tracked me everywhere. When I took Amira to school, she stood by the gate pretending to chat with a group of residents, her gaze locked onto me. When I watered the plants, she walked past, smiling like royalty surveying her subject. I started noticing how the other residents lowered their heads when she walked by, how conversations stopped the moment she appeared. The whole community lived under control through stares, cold smiles, and absurd warning slips that could show up on anyone's doorstep. I realized I wasn't just living in a neighborhood. I had stepped into the territory of a miniature monarchy where Marjorie Hale held the whip, and the rest had resigned themselves to being puppets. But I was different. I'd dealt with people who thought they were untouchable before, and I knew exactly how they felt. Every time I stepped into the garage and saw the outlet still marked by scratches from her Tesla cable, it felt like a hand tightening around my throat. Not because of a few dollars in electricity, but because of the sheer level of disrespect. I remembered every moment in my life when I'd been looked at the same way, with that condescending gaze from people who thought wealth made them above the rule. I told myself if I didn't take a stand, Amira would grow up in a world where she'd have to accept injustice as the norm, and that was something I would never allow. One night, while checking the camera again, I saw Marjorie, same posture, same confident. This time, she lingered longer. She even glanced through my window, as if to make sure I wasn't home. At that moment, I clenched my fist. I knew the game wasn't over, but if she thought I would back down, she had picked the wrong opponent. I ended that day with a sentence ringing in my head. "All right, you want a war? Then I'll show you the real rule." On the day of the HOA meeting, I knew for certain that Marjorie would find a way to assert her power. The entire Lakeshore Heights neighborhood packed into the community hall, rows of chairs filled, people standing, whispering their own side conversations. The air was already tense. Whenever Marjorie showed up, felt like the room lost oxygen. She was already on stage, suit spotless and gleaming, her hair immaculately styled, and on her lips a smile that couldn't hide the smugness. In her eyes saw no respect, only a hunger for dominance and display. Marjorie opened with a syrupy tone, but every word came laced thorn. Our community has been built over many years on the highest standard. That is why we cannot tolerate actions that disrupt our sense of unity. She paused, as if to draw every eye toward her, then continued. New residents often don't fully understand how things work and aren't yet familiar with the spirit of integration. Unfortunately, that has caused unnecessary. A few scattered nods appeared, followed by a couple of murmured, "That's right." I sat still, arms crossed, waiting to see where she was planning to take. Then Marjorie looked straight at me, not even trying to be subtle. Her eyes gleamed with challenge. Some people come from less fortunate neighborhoods. They're different. Here, we maintain standards. We protect our refined image. And clearly, some newcomers have yet to grasp what that means. Her words landed like a blade. I heard a few scoffs, sideways glances, and someone nudging an elbow as if enjoying a live drama. I clenched my jaw and stared right back. The room thickened with tension. The prejudice laid bare, unapologetically on display. I stood up, voice steady, not loud, but clear. "Are your standards stealing electricity from my home? I have footage showing you personally plugging your Tesla into my outlet. Is that the model behavior you want this community to follow?" The room fell silent. The smirks vanished. Every eye turned toward the stage. Marjorie froze for a split second, her lips tightening. Then she gave a contemptuous smile, shrugged if I had said something ridiculous. "Mr. Cole, you're being childish. Someone like you will never understand the stature of this community. Here, we don't obsess over petty things. What you call stealing, we call sharing for the sake of harmony." I laughed, a dry, cutting sound that echoed through the still room. "Harmony? You call siphoning power from a neighbor's home and standing here preaching about standards harmony? If that's your idea of stature, then I'd say you're dragging this whole community straight to the bottom." A few faces near me tried to hide their agreement, their eyes briefly lighting up before dropping down again. I knew they were afraid of retaliation. This HOA had turned them into birds, scared of bent branches. No one dared speak up, even when the truth was staring them in the face. Marjorie didn't back down. She stepped forward, placed both hands on the wooden podium. Her voice hissed through clenched teeth, still coated in that fake calm. "Mr. Cole, your accusations are absurd. Do you know how many people dream of living here? We do not lower our standards because one newcomer feels uncomfortable. If you're unhappy, the door out of Lakeshore Heights is always open." I didn't sit down. I looked her straight in the eyes, then swept my gaze across the room. Is it a door out, or a door forced open by a pile of penalty slip? How many people here had to sell their home, leave in frustration, because they couldn't bear your oppression? I'm not surprised no one speaks. Everyone knows the moment you raise your voice, you become a target. The air in the room turned to lead. I saw a few people in the back row bow their heads, their eyes filled with shame. Maybe they remembered being victims themselves, or turning their backs on neighbors just to protect their own status. Marjorie laughed, a sharp, cutting laugh. "You can invent all the stories you want, but the truth is, you're just a small resident with no idea what it means to preserve shared value. And I've been elected 8 terms in a row. I led this place to the position you're now desperate to belong to." I nodded, voice slow but razor sharp. "Elected how? Through fear, through forced silence, through stacks of warning letters. Yes, you led, but you led this entire community down a path of ruin. This community continues to be ruled by you. Then those so-called shared values are nothing more than a mask for your own power grab." For a moment, I saw Marjorie slip, face flushed red, eyes blazing. She slammed her hand against the podium, sharp bang making everyone flinch. "Enough, Mr. Cole. I won't let a newcomer cause chaos. I warn you, this HOA has rules and you'll pay the price. Keep slandering me." I let out a cold laugh. "You stole electricity from my house, in plain view of the neighbors and the camera. Don't talk to me about rules because you're the first to break. If you think I'll stay silent, you're wrong." The murmurs started again. Not mocking laughter this time, but tension, unease, and a suppressed curiosity. They were witnessing something that had never happened before. A resident standing up, facing Marjorie head-on. And once the truth is dragged into the light, it's not so easy to shove it back into the dark. As the meeting came to a close, I saw Marjorie down from the stage, her heels clicking evenly against the floor, but her stride far more rigid than when she walked up. She passed by me, leaned in just enough, and whispered so only I could hear, "You'll regret." I stood still, saying nothing. In my eyes, it was no longer a threat. It was proof she had shown her true face, someone clinging to power, afraid of anyone who dares to look straight at her lie. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I also knew that from this moment on, Lakeshore Heights had changed. People had heard a question they'd never dared to ask before: who truly rules the place, and do they deserve? After the meeting, I knew for sure that Marjorie wouldn't let things slide. She had been exposed in front of the entire community, and to preserve the kind of power built on fear, she needed to send a clear message. Anyone who dared to challenge her would pay the price. In the days that followed, that warning became reality, as if an invisible storm had begun to seep into every corner of my life. That morning, the sky was clear with a light breeze. The August air still carried summer's warmth, but a hint of autumn's chill was beginning to creep in. I had just stretched and stepped out onto the lawn, barely drawing a full breath of the early morning air, when my eyes landed on a white sheet of paper firmly stuck to the front door. A notice from the HOA, the Homeowners Association. The message was printed in bold: no more, no less. Grass exceeds 3 inches, must be trimmed immediately. Failure to comply will result in a fine of $150. I laughed out loud, a mix of irritation and disbelief. My lawn had been mowed 2 days earlier, the scent of fresh earth still hanging in the breeze, the grass smooth and evenly green like a golf. I bent down and measured it. The longest didn't even reach 2.5 inches. Everything was perfect, at least through the eye's fairness. But here, truth didn't live in numbers. Truth lived in Marjorie's. The next day, just as I got home from work, another notice was waiting in the mailbox. Mailbox does not meet aesthetic standards. Must be replaced with community-approved design. I looked at my mailbox, painted black, brand new, not a single scratch, placed squarely beside the walk. Then I looked at the neighbor. Jeff's mailbox leaned so far to one side it looked ready to snap. Mrs. Turner's had peeling paint flaking off like snake skin. Number 21's was faded wood, like it had survived 10 winters without a touch-up. And yet I was the only one being cited. This wasn't rule enforcement. It was a hunt. I didn't need anyone to tell me who was pulling the strings behind the curtain. Each notice, each bullet point, was a knife cut designed not kill, but to make me bleed slowly. The neighbors started looking at me differently, not with disgust, but certainly not with friendliness. It was the look people give when they see an unfamiliar car parked on their familiar street. Part curiosity, part caution, part quiet pity. They knew I had become a thorn in the HOA's side, and in this neighborhood no one touches thorns, because if they do, the blood will be their own. Their indifference wasn't cruelty, it was weak, but knowing that didn't make the isolation any easier to bear. Their silence was living proof that Marjorie had succeeded in bringing the entire community to its knees. Late in the afternoon, just as the sun dipped behind the tree line, I drove home after a long, exhausting day. As I turned onto my street, the scene in front of me made my blood boil. Marjorie's silver Tesla was right up against my garage entrance, its front end aimed directly at the outlet on my wall. The charging cable stretched taut, plugged straight into my socket like it had been made to serve her. Sat casually in the front seat, phone in hand, legs crossed in total ease. When my eyes toward her, she looked up, locked eyes, and gave a slow smile. The smile of someone provoking on purpose, fully aware of the violation and savoring every second of it. I didn't hesitate. I turned off the engine, got out, and walked straight to the front of the car. "Mrs. Hale, unplug it. This isn't a public charging station. This is my electricity." My voice wasn't loud, but it pulsed with anger. She lifted her head, still motionless, her gaze calm, as if I were the one causing the problem. "Mr. Cole," she said lightly, like a breeze, but her tone dripped with arrogance. "You really don't get it. This HOA is mine. I decide, I use, and you don't have the authority to stop." I clenched my fist. "The HOA isn't personal property. This community doesn't belong to you, and this outlet certainly doesn't." She laughed, a sound sharp as a razor blade grazing skin. "Who do you think people will believe? You're just the newcomer. I've been president for 8 terms. Around here, my word is law, and you're the disposable exception." Each word struck like a needle to my pride. I was about to respond when the murmurs behind me pulled me back to reality. A few residents had stopped while passing by, watching in silence, eyes fixed on me before quickly turning away. Just before they moved on, I heard a whisper loud enough for me to catch. "Definitely not the kind of person who belongs here." A short sentence, cold and cruel. I turned around. Their eyes immediately dodged mine, their steps quickening as if afraid of catching something. Marjorie saw everything, and her smile widened, brighter, fuller, the grin of someone claiming victory. I bent down and yanked the charger out of the socket, dropping it on the ground. "If you keep this up, I'll make all the evidence public. This community might fear you, but justice never belongs to those who abuse power." Marjorie squinted, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. But the smile stayed. "You think anyone's going to stand with you? You're only making yourself more isolated, and maybe you'll be packing your things sooner than you think." The Tesla pulled away, its tires hissing softly against the hot pavement. The smell of burnt plastic from the torn cable still lingered. I stood there in the fading light, chest burning as if a firestorm had ignited inside me. But within that fury, a cold clarity began to shape. I knew exactly what she wanted. She wanted me to lose control, to give her an excuse to crush me under the weight of fabricated rules. I wouldn't let that happen. To take down someone like Marjorie, rage wasn't enough. I needed patience and a plan sharp enough to sever the strings of power she was pulling. That night, the living room was silent, as if the world outside no longer existed. Amira sat at the desk doing her homework, the desk lamp casting a warm yellow glow. I sat across from her, laptop open, reviewing every second of footage from the security, every clip of Marjorie stealing power, every smug glance, every time she walked like an untouchable monarch. They were all pieces of a puzzle building toward the truth. I saved each file, named them carefully, and organized every bit of evidence. I knew the day she would have to face the consequences was drawing near. But during those days, what I endured wasn't just few penalty notices or invasions of privacy. The worst part was the way people looked at me, their practiced indifference, the soft whispers laced with layers of judgment. I saw clearly that I was being sorted out, pushed beyond the boundaries of an invisible circle they called standard, a quiet but brutal method of protecting blind consensus. I understood then this wasn't a battle with a single person. It was a fight against a system too comfortable in fear and false. If I wanted to live truthfully, not bowing, not compromising, I had to accept that I'd be standing alone. But in that isolation, I found resolve. They might fear her, but I didn't. And soon, this neighborhood would have to take another look at the man they once labeled an unnecessary outsider. Not through a shouting match, through the truth, raw and undeniable. I knew Marjorie wouldn't stop after the public humiliation and the relentless wave of harassment. The way she stood in the middle of the community meeting, smirking as the entire neighborhood eyed me with caution, made one thing painfully clear. This was just the beginning for her. The endless stream of absurd citations left at my door, like daily needles pressed into skin, was only the warm-up in a long campaign to crush anyone who dared to stand up. But if she thought she had pushed me back, she was deeply mistaken. I didn't come here to bow my head, and instead of fear, I chose to dig deeper into the termite nest called the HOA, a structure dressed in the name of community, but in truth, a power tool for a single person. One gloomy afternoon, gray clouds drifting across the sky like ink spreading in water, I walked around the central lake, the spot where families brought their children, where the elderly exercised, where everything seemed peaceful and perfect to the point of feeling fake. It was the scene the HOA used as the poster image in neighborhood newsletters, a harmonious and civilized community. But beneath that quiet surface, something always felt off, as if everyone were living inside a theater, each person rehearsed in their role, and anyone who missed a line would be swiftly cut from the cast. As I paused beside a stone bench, an elderly man approached. He wore an old button-down shirt with frayed shoulders, white hair tucked under a worn-out baseball cap. His eyes darted nervously, as if afraid of being seen. He lowered his head, voice raspy with age, but urgent. Everyone's scared of her. If you cross Marjorie, sooner or later you'll be fined until you're forced to sell your house. He spoke quickly, each word dragged from a throat tightening with fear, then walked away without waiting for a response. I watched his thin frame disappear, saw in every step a lifelong fear turned into habit, a submission so deep it had become second nature, like a dog that no longer flinches at the whip. What he said wasn't a revelation, but it was a crucial piece of the picture I was slowly putting together. I started spending more time at the county's public records office, a quiet place few visited, filled with the smell of old paper and damp photocopier, but holding everything Marjorie would never want residents to see. I sifted through files, read every note, details that seemed harmless on their own, but when connected, revealed something foul. Marjorie was the owner of a real estate company, something not criminal in itself, but the deeper I dug, clearer it became that none of it was a coincidence. That company, over time, had systematically acquired numerous homes within this very community, not through standard transactions, through the gradual collapse of the families who once lived. I read each record, watched the names of old residents vanish from the files, replaced first by shell companies, and eventually signed over to Marjorie. The sale prices were below market, some shockingly low. The common pattern was clear. Those families had all been heavily fined by the HOA for grass too long, house paint not matching the code, dogs barking too loudly, trash cans placed out at the wrong time, reasons that sounded like jokes yet pushed them closer to the point of being unable to stay. And when they had no choice but to leave, the one who profited every time was Marjorie. I remembered the triumphant look in her eyes during that meeting when she declared, "This HOA is mine." At the time, I thought it was just the bluster of a narcissist wielding power, but now I understood. It was the plain truth. She didn't just rule in name. She had turned every home into a game piece in her property hoarding strategy, form of rule rooted in calculated cruelty, cold and efficient like a grinding machine. As I pored over the data, one detail chilled me. When comparing penalty records, I uncovered a glaring injustice. Households of color and middle-income families were fined 3 times more often than white and affluent residents. It wasn't just bias, it was an unofficial policy. Those citations weren't random. They were tools, clearing the path for Marjorie and her company to expand their grip. I met with more residents, but all would only speak when absolutely sure no one else was around. A middle-aged black woman told me her son had once been banned from the community pool for disruptive behavior, all because he was laughing loudly while playing. Meanwhile, white children could scream, splash, and run wild without a word of reprimand. A Latino family had been fined for painting their house the wrong shade, even though the color was identical to their neighbors, except that neighbor was a white family with close ties to the HOA board. Each story might seem small in isolation, but when stitched together, they form a wide, undeniable picture of systemic injustice. I realized that what I was facing wasn't just stolen electricity or arrogance. Those were merely the visible cracks in the surface, a fractured mask revealing a well-oiled, authoritarian, discriminatory machine beneath. Marjorie didn't need to shout that someone was lesser. She only had to issue citations, stack fees, and drip-feed humiliation. And the residents, they had been scared into rationalizing that shame as something normal. Every time someone fell, the silence deepened, and in that silence, she kept building her empire. I left the records office that day carrying a stack of documents, feeling like I was holding Marjorie's entire list of sins. But what made my heart pound wasn't the paperwork. It was the growing clarity in my mind. This fight was no longer about reclaiming an electrical outlet, no longer about a few $100s in electricity, or an unfair citation for a mailbox. This was a battle to end a filthy empire, one where power fed on fear, where success was built on tears and exclusion. That night, when I came home, Amira was sitting in the living room reading a book. She looked up, worry in her eye. "Dad, are we in trouble?" I looked at her, brushed her soft hair back, smiled, and didn't answer right away. She was still too young to fully understand what was happening, but she was sensitive enough to feel the pressure hanging over the house. I wanted to tell her everything would be fine, that we were okay. Deep down, I knew trouble was already here, and it would only grow. But this time, I had no intention of backing down, because I had seen the truth, and once you've seen it, you can't look away. The garage, once just a space for the car and a few old boxes, now looked like a makeshift technical outpost. Cold white lights mounted on the ceiling reflected off the new metal workbench I had set up. I added insulation to the surfaces, installed a small wooden partition to block outside view, and spread out all the electronic tools across the tabletop. Wires, circuit boards, circuit breakers, voltage meters, test batteries, everything arranged in a precise order. I wasn't a professional technician, but I knew enough to read circuits and build something sophisticated enough to go unnoticed. On the wall, I installed a device that looked entirely ordinary, a white electrical outlet, standard issue for this neighborhood. It didn't draw attention, but inside was something I had spent 2 weeks perfecting, a power surge trap capable of releasing intermittent current strong enough to fry a charging unit, but without leaving clear evidence. I called it the trap switch. From the outside, it looked no different than any other outlet. No exposed wires, no noise, no indicator light. Every component inside had been meticulously calibrated, only activating when the electrical load matched specific pattern, the kind drawn by a Tesla charger. I had spent 3 nights testing it on dead battery, adjusting voltage levels, and adding an auto disconnect to protect my home system. I knew I was going far, but I also knew that if I wanted to beat Marjorie, I couldn't rely on principle or fairness. I needed a strike aimed directly at her pride, a blow she couldn't deflect. I went over everything one more time, measured output voltage, tested the startup cycle, and simulated circuit failure. Enough to overload a Tesla battery in seconds, but not enough the main breaker or cause a fire. Dangerous, yes, but I had calculated carefully. My home system could handle it. I documented all the settings, lightly marked the upper limits on the device in pencil, then erased them. Every trace had to be gone. I stopped working, stood still in the garage, staring staring at that small outlet as if it were a loaded weapon. The air carried a faint scent of burnt plastic from old test wire, the smell of tension and foreboding. No one saw me at that moment, but I knew full well this wasn't a lab anymore. This was a front line. One evening, while I was checking the hidden camera feed wired through the flower bed out front, Marjorie appeared out of nowhere. I heard the soft roll of tires, looked up, and saw her standing at the entrance to the driveway, staring directly at. My heart nearly stopped. She didn't speak, just walked forward slowly, phone in hand, eyes scanning. In my hand was the camera controller, no bigger than a fingertip, but if she looked closely, there was no way I could explain why I was crouched over the flower bed at 8 o'clock at night. I stood up, trying to stay calm, my hand slipping behind my back to hide the device in my pocket. She stepped closer, eyes narrowing as she looked toward the bush, right where the camera lens sat between two small branches. For a split second, I thought everything was about to collapse, but then the phone in her hand rang. She glanced down, her expression shifting instantly to irritation. "Excuse me, I have to take this call." Then she turned and walked away. I stood frozen. It took me several minutes to breathe normally again. There are no words to describe the feeling when a month-long plan nearly goes up in smoke because of one glance. But she hadn't noticed, or maybe at that moment she had something more pressing on her mind. I retreated to the garage that same night. Sweat still clung cold to my back. I checked the system again, wiped dust off the lens, and reset the camera angle. No more mistake. One was enough. She wouldn't give me a second. Sitting back in the chair, I opened my laptop and replayed the footage. Her silhouette was clear in the frame. Even in the dark, the camera was still working. Nothing had been disturbed. I stared at the screen, my hand gripping the mouse. Thought came to me, sharp and unshakable, like a warning echoing in my head. This strike must be precise. One shot. Keep her from ever rising again. I had no intention of causing physical harm, but I would strip away the confidence that let her act like royalty. In the days that followed, I kept to my normal routine. Took Amira to school in the morning, dinner at night, tended to the lawn like nothing had happened. I even mowed the grass twice that week, exactly on schedule, giving the HOA no reason to come after me again. Every action was deliberate, every small step aimed at a single goal. Marjorie, as I predict, resumed parking near the garage. She grew bolder by the day. One afternoon, she even sat in her car eating a pastry while charging, radio blast. She thought I had given up, that the warnings, the citations, the neighborly isolation had finally broken me. But she had no idea that the outlet she used daily had become the fuse to her downfall. I waited patiently for the right moment. I needed undeniable proof, the camera to catch everything. I needed her to walk into the trap on her own, naturally unforced, leaving no room for denial. And when it happened, I would let the truth do the rest. Each night after Amira went to bed, I sat in the garage, the glow from the computer screen lighting my face. I reviewed the footage frame by frame, logging the time of each charge, the model of the car, and the parking angle. I studied her pattern, how she exited the vehicle, how she connected the cable, how long she stayed. Every detail mattered. I knew that if this strike landed, I wouldn't just bring down Marjorie, I'd crack the shell of authority she'd spent years constructing, and once there was a crack, the rest of the community would start asking questions. They had lived in fear far too long. All it would take was one person to break that silence, and the others would start to wake up. But I wasn't naive. I knew that if I failed, I would have to leave this. Not just because Marjorie would do everything in her power to retaliate, but because I would lose my own belief in myself. The final night before making my move, I stood in the garage, staring at the small outlet, every device in position. I went over everything again. Every screw, every wire. There could be no mistake. Not a single detail could stray from the plan. I told myself, every word clear in my mind like a vow. This time, no one else will be forced out of their home. No more families buried in fines and shame. This time, the one who leaves will be her. I turned off the lights, locked the garage, and stepped inside the house. Amira was already asleep, her soft breathing echoing faintly through the door. I stood in the darkness, silent. Tomorrow morning, I will do nothing. I would simply wait. The outlet was ready. That afternoon, the sun felt like it was trying to melt the entire street. Children's voices echoed from the grassy area by the lake, and a few residents sat on their porches exchanging small talk. I stood inside the house, watching the garage through the narrow window slit. My heart was steady. Not fast, not slow. Everything seemed to be waiting for the right moment. Then she appeared, Marjorie Hale, in a blindingly bright suit, walking with her signature stride, arrogant, untouchable. Her sleek silver Tesla rolled up to the edge of my driveway, tires scraping the pavement with a sharp hiss. I saw her pop the trunk, pull out the charger, and walk straight toward the outlet I had prepared. She looked toward my house, her lips curling into a mocking smile. "You'll never stop me," she said, loud enough for the nearby residents to hear. It wasn't just a challenge to me, it was a declaration to the entire community that she still held the upper hand. I didn't respond. I just watched, eyes fixed on her every move. The charger clicked into place, faint snap of the connection ringing out. One heartbeat passed, then another. Pop. A short, crisp explosion made everyone flint. A gray plume of smoke shot out from the battery port, and in a flash, red flames burst forth, consuming the side of the car. The nearby residents jumped to their startled voices rippling down the block. The Tesla, Marjorie's proud symbol, her shining trophy, was now burning in front of everyone. Marjorie stumbled through the rising smoke. She screamed, her voice cracking in panic. "My car! You ruined my car!" Her trembling fingers pointed directly at me, her eyes full of rage and disbelief. I didn't move, didn't lift a finger to hide my satisfaction. I crossed my arm, gaze calm and steady. "No," I said, voice just loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You did that to yourself. Steal, and you pay." I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to explain anything more. More popping sounds came from the Tesla's battery pack, burst flame flaring again and again until the entire car, once Marjorie's ultimate source of pride, was engulfed. The whole neighborhood with the moment. People poured out of their homes, abandoning lunch, dropping conversations on their lawn, gathering in front of my house. They stood in a circle, jaws slack, eyes wide, watching the once luxurious silver Tesla turn into a charred wreck before their eyes. Some pulled out their phones to record, the clicking of cameras sounding off nonstop. A few whispered, "God, that's Mrs. Hale's car." Another added, "How could this happen?" The murmurs spread like a wave, part panic, part morbid fascination. But among them, I clearly heard a few low voices that didn't bother to hide their satisfaction. Serves her right. The fire reflected on Marjorie's face, distorting her into something unrecognizable. The woman who once stood tall at the podium, proudly declaring, "This HOA is mine," was now reduced to a stunned figure. Eyes glassy with tears, hair in disarray, expensive shoes dusted with ash. I stood still, watching, missing nothing. In my mind, every second of this would serve as evidence for the community. Her abuse of power, her arrogance, and her pathetic excuse for sharing electricity had all been destroyed by her own hand. The Tesla wasn't just a vehicle, it was a symbol, and now that symbol was being obliterated publicly in front of dozens of witnesses. A few residents whispered among themselves. I caught part of a conversation between an elderly couple standing near the gate. The husband shook his head. "Told you, sooner or later she had to pay." His wife responded soft, her voice a mix of fear and satisfaction. "But I didn't think it would be like." Someone younger turned to a group of friends, voice buzzing with energy. "If this hits the internet, it's gonna explode. Mrs. Hale is done." Their words passed by me like the wind, but I didn't need to join in. I already knew. The ripple effect had begun. Marjorie finally screamed, her voice raw and bitter. "Everyone saw! He ruined my car. He set me up." She pointed at me, her entire body trembling with fury. I smirked and looked her straight in the eye. "Say what you want. Everyone saw you plug it in yourself. I never touched that car. You did this. You destroyed yourself." The crowd began murmuring. "She did plug it in," a middle-aged man said loudly. "No one forced her. She did it." Those words pierced straight through Marjorie's cracked confidence. She froze, face pale as paper, lips moving without forming anything coherent. The last flames finally died as the firefighters arrived. They sprayed water, and smoke billowed into the sky, leaving behind a twisted, blackened frame. The crowd watched in silence, then slowly turned their eyes to me and Marjorie. In that silence, I could hear the steady beat of my heart, the sound of justice being carried out. I turned to her, voice cold. "From now on, if you ever think about stealing again, remember these ashes. That's the price of arrogance." Marjorie tried to respond, but the words caught in her throat. All she could do was tremble, eyes locked on the wreckage, then flicking to the faces around her. Faces that no longer held fear, only contempt and thinly veiled satisfaction. I knew I had won something greater than personal revenge. This wasn't just my fight. It was a blow to the entire system of fear she had built. The people needed proof that Marjorie's power wasn't untouchable, and I had given them that proof. Without another word, I turned and walked back into the house, leaving behind a community that had just watched false power go up in flames. After the fire was put out, the atmosphere in the neighborhood didn't settle, flared up again like a different kind of blaze, this time in the form of whispered chatter. All around, from the grass by the lake to the front porches of homes, residents gathered in small clusters, voices low but spreading fast. I saw it with my own eyes. She plugged in the charger herself, A middle-aged man spoke while pointing toward my garage. What's there to deny now? She really was stealing Someone next to him chimed in, unable to hide satisfaction. Serves her right. She thought power meant doing whatever she wanted. The news spread so fast that by the end of the afternoon, everyone had heard and had something to say about it. Children ran around reenacting the pop and mimicking the smoking Tesla, their parents pulling them back, though not without a smile. For many, the image of Marjorie standing dazed beside the ashes lingered more vividly than the flames themselves. Marjorie refused to be swallowed by the wave. She stood in the middle of the crowd, her voice hoarse from screaming, but still raised it to drown out the whispers. Listen to me. This was sabotage. He set a trap, and he made my car explode. This wasn't my fault. She repeated herself again and again, eyes darting in all directions, searching for agreement. But instead of support, the residents glanced at each other, then leaned in to whisper harsher truth. They no longer feared her like before. With the truth now exposed, no amount of polish could cover it up. An elderly woman stood up, her voice sharper than anyone had heard from her before. Marjorie, we saw everything. You plugged that charger into Mr. Cole's outlet. Camera caught it clearly. Don't insult us by pretending we're blind. The words hit like a slap, draining the color from Marjorie's face. I didn't step in. I stood back and let the community speak for me. I knew this was a turning point. The silence that had once been Marjorie's greatest ally had now turned against. Another resident raised their voice, angry and direct. She fined me for having the wrong color mailbox, and here she is stealing power? What kind of standard is that? Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then spreading through the crowd. I saw in their eyes not just satisfaction, but relief, like they were finally being freed from an invisible weight carried for too long. Marjorie tried to hold herself together, but her voice wavered. Don't believe him! He just got here. He's trying to destroy this community. She pointed at me, desperate to cast me as the outsider. But the crowd no longer followed her script. Her screams fell flat, empty of authority. I caught the eyes of a few neighbors. They nodded to me. Small nods, but ones that carried weight. They signaled that the balance was shifting. For the first time, they weren't looking at me as an outsider, but as someone solid to hold on to now that Marjorie's mask had finally fallen. The murmurs spread through the neighborhood, and no one held back anymore. From behind windows, figures leaned out and exchanged blunt words no one had dared to say before. She ruled for too long. This is the end. No one believes her anymore. Marjorie stood there, her body like a crumbling statue. I knew the fire hadn't just destroyed the Tesla. It had burned away the trust the residents once had in her. And when that trust is gone, all that remains of power is an empty shell. I turned and walked back inside, leaving the community to speak for itself. I didn't need to say another word, because the truth was speaking on its own now, and it was louder than any accusation. The street filled with voices, rising like waves, crashing again and again. As the smoke from the Tesla thinned, the front yard became a kind of forum, where voices long silenced began to break free. A salt-and-pepper-haired man who used to lower his head whenever Marjorie walked by stepped out from the crowd. His voice was rough, firm. I was fined just for leaving a wooden chair on my porch. She said it was unsightly and charged me $300. When I protested, she threatened to raise my community. I had to grit my teeth and pay. He paused, eyes drifting toward the burnt-out car, then around at the other. Turns out I wasn't alone. We've all been under the same. A young woman near the fence spoke up, voice shaking but resolute. My child was banned from the playground for causing a disturbance, while the rich kids played as loud as they wanted. Today, I finally feel like justice is possible. Heads nodded around her. A few people clapped, timid at first, enough to build momentum. An Asian resident stepped forward, voice thick with emotion held in too long. My house was fined for planting flowers by the front door. She said they didn't meet neighborhood standards, but the same flowers are in her best friend's yard. Now I understand. Her standards were just a cover for discrimination. The stories came pouring out, each one like a hammer blow against the decaying wall of Marjorie's authority. She staggered, trying to cut in, stammering, "It was the rules. I was just enforcing the rules." But no one was listening anymore. Fear that once silenced them had vanished. I stood still, watched. There was no need to rally them. This moment had awakened the fury they had buried. The burning Tesla was no longer just a wrecked car. It had become a symbol. It said everything. Power is not permanent, and arrogance comes with a price. A young man held up his phone, recording, voice buzzing with excitement. People need to see this. Her fancy car burned to ash, and everyone knows why. He swept the camera across the crowd, capturing every face, every stare. Faces that once stayed quiet now lit up with satisfaction. The air felt like an underground celebration, a mix of shock, joy, and relief. Marjorie kept shouting, but her voice was drowned out by the flood of stories being told. Each person added a piece of evidence, forming a massive indictment. excitement. Truth she had hidden for years was now exposed in full view, leaving nothing left to deny. I saw a clear change in my neighbor's eye. They no longer avoided my gaze, no longer acted like I was the troublemaker. Now they looked at me with quiet respect, as if my resistance had opened a path for them to step out of the shadows. I didn't need their applause. I only needed to know that Marjorie had lost her most powerful weapon, fear she once instilled. Smoke still rose faintly from the twisted metal frame, and the scent of burning lingered in the air. But to the residents, that sight was no longer a disaster. It was living proof justice, even if late, could still find a place to stand. Arms folded, I looked out across the crowd and spoke slowly. Everyone sees it now. She was never a symbol of standards. She was just someone who believed she had the right to stand above us all. And today, it was the truth that brought her down. No one objected. The whispers shifted into nods of agreement. This community, for the first time in years, had witnessed the real crack in the throne Marjorie had built for herself. And I knew, from here on out, the path to her full collapse was only a matter of time. The HOA meeting room was packed that day. There were no seats left, and residents stood shoulder to shoulder against the walls, every face marked with tension. This was no longer a routine meeting. It felt more like a public trial where everyone was waiting for the verdict. Marjorie stepped up to the wooden podium, her stride no longer commanding, though she tried to maintain a facade of confidence. Her light-colored suit had been freshly changed, but it couldn't mask the fatigue in her eye. She began in her usual tone, the same voice that had silenced this community for years. Fellow residents, what occurred last week was a serious incident. A Tesla vehicle was damaged, and the perpetrator is none other than Miss Cole. He set a trap, deliberately sabotaged private property, and endangered our community. Murmurs immediately spread across the room. Some frowned, others scoffed. I saw the division clearly, but this time, no one seemed to fully buy into her word. Marjorie pressed on, her voice rising, as if to drown out the reaction. Let me remind you, the HOA has clear regulations. All residents must ensure safe and are prohibited from installing hazardous electrical devices. Mr. Cole violated this rule, and under the law, we have the right to take action. I stood up. Without rushing, I placed a small USB drive on the table and plugged it into the projector already set up. The large screen lit up, displaying the footage from my garage. The room fell silent as Marjorie appeared on screen, holding the charging cable, calmly plugging it into the outlet. No one else was present, no force, her and her undeniable action. My voice rang out, steady and firm. This is the truth. No one in this room can deny it. She plugged it in with her own hand. She disregarded the very rules she insists upon. I didn't set a trap. I didn't touch her car. She did it herself, and now she faced the consequences. A pause settled over the room. Then came the murmurs again, heavier this time. A few residents near the front leaned toward each other, but there was no scoffing at me now. Instead, eyes began to turn toward Marjorie, filled with doubt and contempt. Marjorie tried to steady her voice, but it trembled. This video, it could have been edited. We cannot base judgment on a single clip. A man in the back stood up, his voice sharp. I was there. I saw her plug in the cable. Stop lying, Marjorie. More voices joined in from across the room. A woman raised her hand. My family was also unfairly fined. I stayed silent because I was afraid, but I'm not afraid anymore. The atmosphere in the room shifted noticeably. The eyes that once looked timid now seemed relieved of their burden. They began to speak out loud, no longer whispering. Each word spoken made Marjorie tremble further, her mask of power cracking piece by piece. The HOA meeting room was packed that day. There were no seats left, and residents stood shoulder to shoulder against the walls, every face marked with tension. This was no longer a routine meeting. It felt more like a public trial where everyone was waiting for the verdict. Marjorie stepped up to the wooden podium, her stride no longer commanding, though she tried to maintain a facade of confidence. Her light-colored suit had been freshly changed, but it couldn't mask the fatigue in her eye. She began in her usual tone, the same voice that had silenced this community for years. Fellow residents, what occurred last week was a serious incident. A Tesla vehicle was damaged, and the perpetrator is none other than Miss Cole. He set a trap, deliberately sabotaged private property, and endangered our community. Murmurs immediately spread across the room. Some frowned, others scoffed. I saw the division clearly, but this time, no one seemed to fully buy into her words. Marjorie pressed on, her voice rising, as if to drown out the reaction. Let me remind you, the HOA has clear regulations. All residents must ensure safety and are prohibited from installing hazardous electrical devices. Mr. Cole violated this rule, and under the law, we have the right to take action. I stood up. Without rushing, I placed a small USB drive on the table and plugged it into the projector already set up. The large screen lit up, displaying the footage from my garage. The room fell silent as Marjorie appeared on screen, holding the charging cable, calmly plugging it into the outlet. No one else was present. No force, just her and her undeniable act. My voice rang out, steady and firm. This is the truth. No one in this room can deny it. She plugged it in with her own hand. She disregarded the very rules she insists upon. I didn't set a trap. I didn't touch her car. She did it herself, and now she faces the consequences. A pause settled over the room. Then came the murmurs again, heavier this time. A few residents near the front leaned toward each other, but there was no scoffing at me now. Instead, eyes began to turn toward Marjorie, filled with doubt and contempt. Marjorie tried to steady her voice, but it trembled. This video could have been edited. Cannot base judgment on a single. A man in the back stood up, his voice sharp. I was there. I saw her plug in the cable. Stop lying. Marjorie. More voices joined in from across the room. A woman raised her hand. My family was also unfairly fined. I stayed silent because I was afraid, but I'm not afraid anymore. The atmosphere in the room shifted noticeably. The eyes that once looked timid now seemed relieved of their burden. They began to speak out loud, no longer whispering. Each word spoken made Marjorie tremble further, her mask of power cracking piece by. I looked her straight in the eye, my voice firm. Mrs. Hale, for years you've turned rules into weapons, turned the HOA into your personal playground. But today, this community sees clearly. No one believes your excuses anymore. Inside the room, fear no longer held the silence. In its place came the sound of hands slapping desks, scattered applause rising into a steady rhythm. The noise swelled, drowning out Marjorie's feeble attempts to object. She stood there still, forcing a smile that twisted awkwardly, pitifully. The power she had clutched for years was stripped bare by a single video and the raw honesty of her accusers. In that moment, I knew her complete downfall was only a matter of time. The HOA meeting room, once stifled by heavy silence, had become a battlefield of voices. After the video played, the air itself seemed to tear open. The objections were no longer whispered but spoken aloud, sharp and insistent. I saw cracks forming within the board. Some members who once silently backed Marjorie shifted uncomfortably in their seat. The man at the secretary's chair adjusted his glasses, eyes lowered to avoid hers. A woman known for her loyalty to Marjorie exchanged a quick glance with her neighbor, then stood and said, I think we need to acknowledge this video as evidence. We can't keep pretending nothing happened. Her voice rang out clear, sending a ripple through the room. Marjorie snapped around, her glare blazing. You're turning on me, Lorna? She shouted, but the edge was panic, not authority. Lorna replied, steady and unshaken. This isn't betrayal. I just can't close my eyes anymore. The people deserve fairness. Her words triggered a wave of agreement. Another board member nodded. We've let this HOA be misused for too long. Someone else added, every time we issued fines, it never sat right with, but we let Mrs. Hale manipulate us. It's time to stop. Marjorie trembled, face drained of color. The light suit she had proudly worn that day was streaked with ash from the Tesla fire, only deepening the image of collapse. Her hands gripped the edges of the podium, knuckles white, like someone clinging desperately to the last threads of power. Have you all forgotten who built Lakeshore Heights? She hissed, but her words echoed into a room filled with doubt. There were no rounds of applause like years past, only stares full of skepticism, tempt, and satisfaction. I stayed silent, knowing this moment didn't belong to me. It belonged to the community. They were witnessing the fall of a false authority, no longer bound by pretty speeches, because the sight of Marjorie standing there, disheveled and trembling, said more than words ever could. A board member who rarely spoke rose from his seat, voice sharp and unwavering. Marjorie, you no longer have the credibility to lead. What happened recently is the final straw. If you have any integrity left, resign. His words hit like a thunderclap, setting the room ablaze. Voices of agreement surged forward, overwhelming Marjorie's sputtering denials. She tried to scream, but her voice broke, reduced to choking sound. The image of a woman who once stood on a podium, barking orders to an entire community, was now nothing but ruin. As I watched her, I knew her power had fractured. The board, once her loyal foundation, had turned away, leaving her teetering on the edge of collapse. In the eyes of everyone present, I saw a truth made plain. Marjorie Hale was no longer the queen of Lakeshore Heights. All that remained was a trembling woman, awkward in a suit smeared with ash, grasping for the last glint of a glory already rotted through. After that meeting, word spread through the community faster than any official HOA announced. Videos from security cameras and residents' phones surfaced online, each frame clearly showing Marjorie plugging in the charger herself, followed by the Tesla erupting into flame. No one believed her excuses anymore. Then came the final blow. The insurance company issued a letter of denial. In a short statement, they made it clear the incident resulted from unauthorized charging and falls outside the scope of coverage. The client is solely responsible, a single sentence, but it crushed Marjorie's last hope. The car, worth tens of thousands of dollars, was now a heap of scrap, and she had no one left to blame. I held that letter, not mine, but shared by a neighbor, and simply smiled. The truth had sealed every door. She had tried to fabricate a story of sabotage, but the insurance company had delivered the verdict for me. There was no way out now. I timed my next move precisely. At the following HOA meeting, I stood in the middle of the room, my voice calm, firm. I demand the HOA return every unjust fine my family was forced to pay. I have evidence that those citations were not based on objective policy, but on abuse of authority. I laid down a stack of documents, copies of fines for overgrown grass, mailbox violations, and trivial issues that never existed. Alongside them, photos of other homes in similar or worse condition, never once penalized. This is the truth. I'm not the only one who was targeted, but I'm the only one who stayed long enough to gather proof. A murmur swept the room. Formerly silent residents nodded vigorously. A woman whispered just loud enough for her row to hear, "We got fined over a fence. Now it all makes sense." An elderly man added slowly, "They pressured us so we'd sell. We've kept quiet too long." Marjorie tried to sit upright, but her face had gone pale. Her closest allies had turned their backs, and several board members nodded in agreement with my request. One of them spoke up loudly. "We can't keep funds collected through injustice. They must be returned." I looked straight at Marjorie, my voice steely. "If the HOA wants to exist as a true community, now is the time to prove it. But if you keep covering for wrongdoing, don't be surprised when people choose another path." No one came to her defense. Even those once fiercely loyal avoided her gaze. The shadow of power she had clung to had vanished. I saw her trembling, fists clenched tight, nails digging into skin, yet she could do nothing more. The burned Tesla was only the beginning. The insurance company's denial letter, the evidence of unjust fines, and the community's rising outrage all converged into a final verdict. Marjorie, once self-declared as the embodiment of community stature, was now nothing more than a disgraced figure surrounded by contempt. I didn't celebrate, nor did I indulge in triumph. I simply saw something self-evident. False power always collapses, and when it falls, it doesn't just take down its wielder. It leaves a lesson for everyone who once stayed silent. Just days after the meeting, petitions began circulating throughout the neighborhood. First, only a few cautious signatures appeared, but soon the list grew by the dozens. People stopped avoiding one another. They knocked on doors, exchanged steady looks. For the first time in years, I saw solidarity in this community's eyes. On a front porch, a young woman told me, "I signed. I used to be afraid of her, but there's nothing left fear now." Everyone's seen her true face. An elderly man with a cane added, "I've lived here 15 years. I never believed the day would come when the residents stood up together. But today is different." The stack of petitions thickened quickly, the once trembling hands of the silent now signing with relief. No one believed Marjorie was an unbreakable wall anymore. The image of that burning Tesla lingered. It had become a silent witness to an inevitable collapse. I heard that Marjorie was still fighting back. She knocked on each board member's door, begging or threatening, but the threats no longer carried weight. When fear is no longer a weapon, all that remains are desperate shouts. Some members even publicly declared their support for her removal. The balance had fully shifted. Late that afternoon, I saw Marjorie sitting alone in her yard. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken. The once pristine, light-colored blazer, once a symbol of her pride, was stained with ash and stripped of its glow. In front of her sat the twisted metal frame of the Tesla, still there, haunting silhouette. She stared into the charred remains. Her shoulders slumped. No trace of the woman who once screamed at the community, "This HOA is mine." I didn't approach. I simply watched from a distance. She was now tasting what so many other residents had endured: helplessness, humiliation, the collapse that comes when fake authority can no longer hold. That was the moment I knew Marjorie Hale had lost everything. Not just her car, not just the HOA presidency, but the very power she had clung to with her life. The petitions were submitted to the local authorities the next day. After years of being suffocated suffocated by unfair rules, the Lakeshore Heights community had finally spoken in unison, and the name Marjorie Hale, once enough to make people flinch, now echoed only as a bitter reminder. I walked home feeling not the thrill of victory, but a deep sense of relief. The straitjacket of fear had finally been undone. I knew that from now on, Amira would grow up in a neighborhood no longer ruled by someone who had crowned herself the law. Along that path, I met many eyes filled with quiet understanding, soft smiles exchanged without need for words. We all knew, collectively and silently, that the moment that Tesla burst into flames had become a turning point. It marked the end of a dark era and the beginning of something new for this community. Have you ever witnessed the collapse of false power? Share your story. Let others see it too. In the days following the petition's approval, Lakeshore Heights gradually returned to its peaceful rhythm. No more wary glances when someone stepped too close to a lawn edge. No more anxious whispers each time a letter from the HOA arrived. On the grassy field by the lake, children played more freely, their laughter echoing in place of the previous strain. I stood on my porch, took a deep breath, and felt the air lighter, as if it had finally been cleansed of the suffocating layer Marjorie had cast over the community. In that moment, I recalled every word she had uttered in the meeting room, her voice steeped in arrogance. This HOA is mine. Now that statement was a punchline. It was repeated in residents' conversations with mocking tone, a ridiculous relic from a time when they lived under her thumb. What she once treated as gospel had become living proof of blind self-importance. Many neighbors came by to chat, no longer with the distant looks I received on my first days here. An elderly man with a cane stopped by, patted me on the shoulder, and said simply, "You did what we waited far too long to see." A woman holding her young child smiled, her silent thanks conveyed in a glance. I understood. They didn't respect me because of the Tesla that burned, but because I had dared to stand up and shatter the wall of fear that had blanketed this entire neighborhood. Amira noticed the change too. She told me her friends no longer seemed cautious, and their parents weren't holding them back anymore. I watched her laugh freely and felt a deep sense of peace. She would grow up in a community that had learned to protect itself instead of bowing down. I reminded myself that the lesson wasn't about a car being torched or a title being stripped. The true lesson was this: false power collapses when people stop staying silent. It was silence that had fueled Marjorie, made her untouchable. But once silence broke, truth found its voice. No power could remain standing. This neighborhood had changed, and so had I. I understood now that to resist isn't only to defend yourself, but to give others the courage to rise when their time comes. Justice doesn't come from signs that say rules on the wall, from the courage of ordinary people. I turned and walked back into the house, my heart unburdened. A chapter had closed, not with the smugness of triumph, but with the conviction that from now on, this community would never again bow to injustice. And in everyone's memory, the image of that burning Tesla forever be a reminder. Arrogance may build a throne, but only justice decides who gets to sit in. The news of Marjorie's removal as HOA president spread almost as quickly as the fire that consumed the Tesla. By mid-morning, those who once bowed to her were now sitting by the lakefront cafe, casually chatting and recounting past events, half surprised, half sarcastic laughter. No one avoided her name anymore, and that, more than anything, was the clearest sign that the shadow of power that had loomed over the neighborhood had completely vanished. Marjorie no longer appeared at the meeting. Her house, once the venue for grand, boastful parties, now sat in silence. The curtains were always drawn, the yard left untended. Residents whispered that she was trying to sell the estate in a hurry, but few paid any real attention. The once bright white suit she wore as a symbol of authority had become a stain that couldn't be scrubbed clean. Whenever someone brought her up, people laughed, treating her as a living reminder of how arrogance inevitably collapsed. I didn't feel the need to mock or gloat. For me, Marjorie's disappearance from this community was already the fairest outcome. A woman who once crowned herself queen had now been erased from the collective memory. That kind of loss weighs heavier than any formal sentence ever. In the days that followed, I passed by the porch and was greeted with smiles, no more averted glances. A man said, "You reminded us that rules aren't weapons for the few to wield." A young woman walking with her child stopped and smiled. Now this really feels like a place worth living in. I stood on the porch, looking out at a street that had returned to calm. Children ran freely. Families chatted without caution, no longer stiffening every time someone walked by. I knew this peace hadn't come on its own. It came from a community that had learned how to break its silence. I closed my journey with a simple sentence, one that stayed etched in my heart. In a neighborhood rules can keep order. But justice only comes when someone dares to confront abuse of power. That truth wasn't just for me, but for anyone who ever thought they had to stay silent. Because the truth is, even a small community mirrors the way the world works. If we don't speak up, those who abuse power grow bolder by the day. But once someone takes that first step, the truth begins spread, sweeping away what's false and leaving behind the foundation of real fairness. And I knew Lakeshore Heights had been changed forever by that fire. Now that everything is settled, I often sit on the porch in the late afternoon, watching the still water of the lake and thinking back on the journey. From an unusual spike in my elect bill, to a tiny camera in the garage, to the day the whole community watched Tesla burst into flame. Each moment became part of an unforgettable chain of events. I had arrived in Lakeshore Heights hoping to find peace, but what I encountered instead revealed the true face of a system manipulated by the heavy hand of Marjorie Hale. This wasn't just a story about a woman stealing electricity to charge her car. It was a mirror reflecting a kind of fabricated power that exists in many communities. It didn't begin with loud, blatant acts, but with quiet imposition. A citation for a mailbox, a warning over paint color, fine for grass height. When residents remained silent, that abuse of power grew, becoming an invisible regime that forced people to live with their heads down. Marjorie capitalized on that silence, turning the HOA into a tool of control, suppression, and discrimination, from skin color to income level. What struck me most was how deeply fear had rooted itself in the minds of my neighbors. They knew they were being treated unfairly, but chose silence because they believed resistance futile. And it was that very silence that made Marjorie untouchable. It wasn't until the truth exploded in public view, until the Tesla, a symbol of arrogance, burned before everyone's eyes, that the fear finally shattered. People began sharing their story, long-buried grievances surfacing at last. The fire that consumed her car became the fire that lit their courage. But reaching that moment didn't come by chance. I had to calculate, to take risk, to step beyond my comfort zone. I told myself one strike had to be precise, one move to ensure the abuser never had a chance to rise again. That resolve didn't come from blind revenge, from a deep desire to restore fairness, for myself and for those living beside me. Had I chosen silence, my story would have vanished like so many other families who had left place in bitter resignation. Looking back, I'm not proud of having burned a car. I'm proud that I helped awaken a community's spirit. The once avoiding eyes now meet mine without hesitation. The whispers have turned into clear, direct voices. One person can ignite the spark, but real power comes from unity. The residents signed the petition to remove Marjorie, no longer driven by fear. That was the moment they reclaimed their voice. The greatest lesson in this story is that justice doesn't arrive on its own. It must be called forth through action. Manufactured power survives because people bow their head. But when someone stands up, not just for themselves, but to lead the way for others, justice has a path back. In Lakeshore Heights, I was merely the first to speak. The rest came from a community that finally agreed. They had endured enough. Another lesson, just as vital, is that no one can live by declaring themselves the law. Marjorie once believed that the HOA title, the gleaming suits, and the arbitrary fines would keep her untouchable. But in the end, those very things betrayed her. The white suit that once symbolized her authority became an indelible stain. The Tesla that once defined her pride became a pile of scorched metal. She lost more than property. She lost the trust of those who once obeyed her out of reluctant submission. And once trust disappears, power vanishes. I believe that anywhere, if someone dares to stand against injustice, the outcome will be the same. There may not always be a burning Tesla to serve as a symbol. Justice always finds a way to reveal itself. It can emerge through a timely word, a brave act, or simply a nod that says, enough. Today, as I walked around the lake with Amira, I felt her hand grip mine tightly. Her eyes were clear when she said, "Dad, now I really feel safe." I smiled. Not just my daughter, but this entire community has finally found peace again. Not the silence of fear, but the true calm that comes from fairness. And if anyone were to ask me what lesson lingers from everything that happened, I would answer with the same words I spoke on the final day. In a neighborhood, rules may keep order, but justice only appears when someone dares to stand against abuse of power.